Hi, everybody. This is Jeff Saltzman from Org Vitality. The webinar is going to start in just a few seconds, waiting for some last minute people to come into the room. We'll begin momentarily. Thanks for your patience. Okay, I think we can get started now. Hi, everybody. My name's Jeff Saltzman. I'm the CEO of Org Vitality. Today's webinar is going to be on strategic survey redesign. And at the risk of, sounding like the old guy telling you're yelling at the kids to get off the lawn, I want to just talk a little bit about the evolution of surveys over time. And I can remember back when all the surveys were done, for instance, on paper. And at the time, the average length of a survey was 125 to, I think the longest survey ever did back then was 250 items. And of course, today, the much more common for surveys to be somewhere around 40 or 50 items. If you remember back, manager training used to be an 8-hour affair where, we would sit managers down and they would practice reading their reports and would design a presentation that they would be giving to their direct reports. And then we would have them practice giving those presentations. And that 8-hour training went to 4 hours, and went to 2 hours, and went to, can you just put some training material on the report itself? And, where will that go in the future is a question mark. And of course, the topics over the years have changed radically as well. When I first started doing surveys, and I'm going back about 35 years, the hot topic was overall satisfaction, and PPP came along, people, profit, and planet was a hot thing for a while. Sarbanes-Oxley was a hot topic for a while. Labor relations, communications, benefits, diversity, and of course, more recently, things like employee engagement. And so the question becomes, and in this webinar, we're really going to be focusing on the content of the survey items themselves, and not the surrounding process of manager training and other things like that. But if there's enough interest, we can do other webinars on how that area has evolved as well. So today's topic is really on the survey content itself. And the presenter today is going to be Dr. Scott Brooks. And you'll see his picture in just a moment. There he is. So Dr. Scott Brooks has a PhD in industrial organizational psychology from The Ohio State University. He's a PSYOP fellow. He's the head of consulting at Org Vitality, and he's a partner here. But more importantly than any of that, Scott is a friend. And every time I listen to him speak on a topic, regardless of what the topic is, I feel like I'm learning something on that. And with that, I think, well, let me also, there's some logistics I guess I should have covered as well. Logistically, you can get a copy of the slides. We can send them out after the presentation. If you have questions, put it into the chat as Scott talks. I'll be monitoring the chat for any questions, and we'll get to as many of those at the end of the webinar as we possibly can. And of course, at any time, if you'd like to do any follow-up with Scott or myself, we'd be happy to chat with you and just kick around any ideas based on, what you see in the webinar. And with that, let me turn it over to you, Scott.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. And hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. And I want to set the stage a little bit as we dive in with 3 definitions. So just bear with me. I'm not going to take you to school that much. But first definition is defining the challenge that we're really talking about here. And the foundational sort of thought that we're going to be tackling is, how do you take a well-crafted, well-used survey and make it even better? So presumably many of you have been doing surveys for a while, right? And that's great. And the surveys had met with a certain amount of success, and you've been doing things that have been great, and executives look forward to it every year. But at the same time, you kind of know that things could be better. Maybe it's an existing survey, it's a good survey, it's well known and used. Maybe the scores are a little extra high, which is awesome because it means you've got a great culture, but they might not be high enough to inspire some change. And it's always maybe a good assumption that you can better cover the uniqueness of the organization and its strategy and better capture the imaginations of executives and employees and everybody. And clearly, when you make changes to something like this, the changes need to honor the past and yet still innovate into the future. It's kind of like we've all felt this, where you can't be held hostage or be frozen just because somewhere somebody might depend on a current item or score. That's just an intolerable situation. So as we get into this webinar, this is about survey content. It's not exactly an item writing workshop. I'll touch on a point or two as we go. It's not really a statistical seminar, and many of you probably just said, thank God. And it's not really about the mechanics of gathering the feedback and cycles and approaches and things like that, but it's about what it is that you're chasing. And so the second definition I want to get into here is really, what is an employee survey? Yeah, there's lots of fact finding and tons of analysis and a bunch of reporting and machinery. But the ultimate goal of a project like this is to do something different. And I want to use this just as a grounding note. So this is the opportunity to focus the organization on a topic. Maybe it's a topic that's kind of predefined, and we'll talk a little bit about what that might mean. And it helps to drive orchestrated, structured conversations throughout the organization on important topics. Even if no scores were ever reported, if a survey drove structured conversation on important topics, I think we'd all call that a win. Now, of course, we have data and everything like that that helps anchor things, which is awesome. But this kind of definition makes it similar to New Year's resolutions for self-improvement. And I think that's an apt comparison for this time of year, when we're all thinking about, maybe resolutions we've made and maybe just as importantly, how to keep those resolutions sticking past about March. And so in the end, the big purpose is about change. Now, we talked about strategic survey redesign. So my third definition, that's going to require a little bit more grounding, is all about strategy. And maybe you've heard some of this before, but it is foundational. I'm going to whip through some pretty high level concepts pretty quickly. Now, importantly, when I use the term strategy or strategic, I'm not talking about the way people use it in hallway conversations or conversationally. Instead, I am talking about the Michael Porter-esque, foundational thinking about what is organizational strategy, right? What is an organization trying to do? And so the first critical point is that strategic is not synonymous with important. Strategy refers to how an organization will make decisions, prioritize, maximize competitive edge, and so forth, in order to fulfill its mission. And importance is just anything that's required for operations. Like, well, you might say, Scott, isn't anything important also strategic? And I'm going to say no. And particularly when we're talking about organizational strategy. And the extreme example here, just to make sort of a silly point, but to drive this home, is, hey, oxygen to breathe is important. It is not in any organization's strategy, not unless you're maybe NASA or SEAL Team 6 or something like that, where the treatment of breathable air is a big issue for you. But oxygen is important, but it does not help relate to an organization's competitive edge. Right. So with this point, strategic is different. How do we know what is strategic? Right. How do we know what's in this light or blue circle? Well, here's some lightning whip through of probably decades of organizational research on strategy and what it all means. But the first is, to be strategic is to be unique. And so what does this mean? You're never going to be a better version of your competition, right? Strategies, organizational strategies, capitalize on factors that competitors find it costly or impossible to copy. You want to be standing out. And so the implication for surveys is that if your survey looks like any other organization's survey, it's not strategic and doesn't really lean into what gives you your competitive edge. It might be a fine survey, it might check the box, it might do what you want it to do, and it can be great and it can be important without being strategic. But if it looks like everybody else's, it's not strategic. Second is strategy is about choices. And so strategy suggests pursuing certain paths over others and directly addressing challenges and bottlenecks. Okay, right? What does that mean for implication? Well, strategy is not synonymous with success, but it talks about how to become successful. And this really relates to strategy is not ambition. So strategies need to suggest how to achieve goals or ambitions. And so increasing market share, increasing customer loyalty, more money in the bank, or just employee engagement. These are ambitions. These are things to maximize. They're metrics to maximize. They don't talk about how you're going to get there or how you're going to improve market share or customer value or whatever it is that you're really trying to do. So with this, I want to touch on a point that Jeff echoed in the beginning, which is the evolution of surveys. And you might say, you know, sure, you've got this about strategy, but surveys haven't always embraced this sort of sense of what strategy is. Over the past 50 years or so, surveys have gone through evolution. I could say 100 years back when Jeff started doing surveys, maybe. But you might have even seen some of this within evolution inside your organization about how people are dealing with surveys. So the sort of first touch point is temperature taking. Better to know than not. You want to know what people are thinking. And that's sort of a starting point for a lot of organizations getting into surveys, but it was also 50 years ago how surveys really started. Kind of moved to employee relations, where happy employees can produce good things. And this is when maybe you want to know how to provide better benefits or work on union relations or something like that. Moved off into engagement, which was about how individuals might be committed to or energized or connected to the mission, and it focused on the part of satisfaction, the part of employee satisfaction that really motivated and energized people. More recently, employee experience, where this is actually ported from customer experience or user experience. And, so what about employee experience or the moments that matter? And this is talking about improving the processes that employees come in contact with, and often has an emphasis on life cycle kinds of things. But it can be tough to pin down because sometimes employee experience means everything. But what we're really talking about here is strategic surveys. And this is the best way to evolve survey programs that we found. A lot of survey programs out in the world, they do a fine job with, all of these other first four sort of steps or phases of evolution might be into one. But focusing on this strategy is what we're going to be dealing with right here today a little bit. It's not only important, but it's often lacking. And so mechanically, you might be asking the question, well, how do we add strategy or the strategic issues to the fundamentals? And we're not talking about taking away all the fundamentals, just making room for some strategic content. So fundamentals tend to be employee-centric kinds of things, like engagement or employee experience. And the strategic is performance-centric kinds of things. How do you extend your leadership vision or reach? How do you focus the conversation on organizational needs? And how do you suggest executive or high level action on strategic choices, like how to do things? And so the best programs include a blend of both. This is the primary point of this webinar. There's a lot of focus on traditional employee experience these days, but that's just part of the story. And sometimes you get lost in that, a little over focused. And if that's all you focus on, that can be fine. It can be a great survey, but you're not really talking about strategy. And you might be very likely missing an opportunity about how to energize the next evolution of your survey. So this brings us to the next question. How do we determine which employee experiences or what part of survey content is there and to be picked and can be strategic for your organization? And it helps if you ask it kind of this way. Where do you want to focus measurement and action? And with any survey, especially a strategic survey, you want to focus most on the strategic elements, the parts that are going to help you become a better organization. Yes, you are also certainly going to act on other things that are important because the employee relationship with an organization is complicated and they can talk about a lot of things. And so you never just want to mono focus on any one thing, but you definitely want to spend most of your time and energy and a lot of a redesign on infusing that strategic element. So how do you do that? What is supporting strategy? And this is another point I can't say enough. You want to work backwards. Work backwards from strategy and strategic directions and outcomes and executive interests into the day-to-day cultural and leadership practices. You don't want to work forwards. A lot of survey work starts with HR people talking about HR things, which can be very important. I don't want to diminish that point, but you wind up a little over focused on some things like engagement or employee experience or whatever the Wall Street Journal just wrote and whatever your CHRO maybe just read in the Harvard Business Review or whatever it is. All of this can still be important, but you want to work backwards. And HBR can be useful and great, but eventually you want to find a short list of strategically relevant topics. And part of the goal here is to capture the imagination of top leadership. And also this will help you refine the survey and focus those conversations and actions on these impactful areas. So that's easy to say, right? It's easy to say, sure. Yeah, Scott knew that already, or kind of had a glimpse of it. But let me illustrate with a couple of case examples that will help identify and illustrate some of how this works. So of these three, the first example, there was an organization, it was a tech company that was trying to emerge from dependence on venture capital funding, and they had a new sales strategy. So this was everything that occupied like all of the executive team meetings and so forth. And this new sales strategy demanded sort of more of a client and organizational co-creation of solutions, which required a lot of cross-functional work between engineers and service people and salespeople and everything like that. And in this, what were some of the cultural elements that needed focus? Well, collaboration, creativity, and dialogue across boundaries were huge. And so in this particular case, the survey focused on this cross-functional collaboration, customer knowledge, service orientation, confidence in these new directions. Now, granted, not all employees were equal informants about all these issues. Everyone across the whole organization was asked about all the core issues, but there was a special supplement for those more heavily involved, like the engineering teams and the service support teams and the sales teams. And so this implied some extra focus on those people who could tell you best about how your strategy was working and how it could be improved. And this is also coming from the people who were most required to change their behaviors and perspectives in the organization. And so this is all about generating those constructive conversations. In fact, like confidence in new directions, one of the things we found is we separated the President's Club salespeople from all the other salespeople. And the President's Club people who are responsible for about 80% of all new business, they were a little bit more critical in specific ways that allowed the organization to think better about how to refine and implement the strategy. So anyway, these were new topics in this particular organization that focused on more strategic elements. Another case, okay, we have a service-centric financial services organization that was facing new regulations. Okay, what does this look like? Well, emerging Department of Labor regulations required compliance with new kinds of approaches, but this was an organization with a long legacy of high-touch service. And you could think about compliance, with rules and service orientation and white glove treatment of customers as being having a little dynamic tension between them. Sometimes they paddle in different directions, like ask people what they want versus tell them what you have to give. And in fact, this kind of thing, this topic of compliance and Department of Labor regulations occupied 70% of all the board conversations, all the recent board of directors conversation. So no brainer. Compliance and service climate were critical. And in fact, when we came in to redesign this survey, those topics weren't even touched at all. And so the survey was redesigned to focus on this customer service orientation. A lot of research out in the world about how that works and what that is, but also getting more into regulatory compliance climate. All right. And then the balance between the two. How do we balance rules with service? That became a real important conversation in this organization. Okay, so different organization, different challenges, different topics that got focused on with a different twist. Last case study that I want to show is this was an organization that was growing like gangbusters, and it was strained with this dramatic global growth. And that was fantastic. It's a great problem to have. But what were some of the things in the cultural and leadership atmosphere that needed to be addressed? Well, onboarding new people, within about 3-4 years, they double in size, and they had been. And so you require bringing people up to speed fast, particularly in pivotal positions, and try to not have people quit, especially in key innovation areas. And so this new employee experience, and not just the experience of like, hey, are you happy and you feel welcomed, but what helps you learn faster? What helps you navigate the organization faster? Those were topics that became huge. And so the survey focused on scalability, and particularly as the employee base grew, knowledge management, consistent enough processes, and maintaining values of the original organization as so many new people came flooding in. And by the way, this scalability topic was infused not just into its own area, but many other survey topics such as managers or leadership development or systems and data treatment or career opportunities, work-life balance, and more. Like manager items, my manager helps me, navigate the organization, get stuff done. That's a different kind of manager item than, yeah, hey, my manager's nice and respects me and provides recognition. It's like my manager helps me understand how to work in this organization. So this was a different kind of organization with different needs. And so this strategic aspect, the parts that leaned into what the organization's challenges were, was really important. Now, importantly, all of these listening programs covered more than just the few critical strategic priorities. They all included familiar topics of manager and career and recognition and engagement and so forth, yet they were designed to drive action toward those unique strategic outcomes above all else. And this is kind of the heart of a strategic survey. You can't dwell all the time in the super heady strategic atmosphere and never get anything practical done. There are fundamentals that are always important. And so this takes us to some survey design implications, right? You got to add the new content. You got to maintain the proper core of where you've been. And to add new, you got to trim the non-essential from what you've had. Because we're kind of assuming a zero-sum game. There's a lot of ways to play this, but let's, for simplicity now, just assume that you don't want to survey any longer than where you have been in the past, maybe even shorter. But let's talk first about the adding part. How do you come up with the new topics to add? And maybe got a hint of it through some of the executive or from some of the case studies I mentioned before. But the real starting point is to engage executives in conversation. And we often use a basic question, and this can be phrased maybe a dozen or 100 different ways, depending on who you're talking to and when. But basically, if the executive team could snap its fingers and have everyone across the organization focus on improving one thing, what would it be? And it's this kind of question that came up with the, Department of Labor and compliance and regulations kinds of things. It's the kind of thing that came up with the scalability issues and so forth and so on. And for you, it'll come up with something different. Um, and importantly here, there's a point, don't simply ask executives what they want in the survey. Ask them what they want to accomplish. This elevates the discussion to action and outcome priorities and keeps it above the mechanics of measurement and maybe wordsmithing. That's your job. That's my job. We don't want to say what item do you want in the survey and so forth. Not all the time. But mostly you want to talk about what are you trying to get done? And then we can step back and say, oh yeah, that one not really appropriate to get done in the survey, but this one I think we can hammer home, like the cross-functional collaboration required for client co-creation of solutions, right? That we can lean into. Now, any executive worth their salt is always thinking about things they want to improve. They always have a list of ambitions that they want to improve. The survey needs to reflect those, right? And not just at a high level, like, hey, we got to be innovative. And so you have some innovation questions, but the scores are always a little too high. There's a mismatch between that passion that the executives have about trying to improve something and what the survey is talking about. And so maybe this new strategic content needs to elevate what's going on. I'll give you some examples in a minute, but your job after chatting with people is to evaluate, what is some of the existing and potential new client. And you do this by assembling the topics from leadership conversations, but also strategic reviews, maybe HR conversations, and understanding of key outcomes of interest. And you also are going to be leveraging some research, maybe outside of the organization or benchmarking, but you need to expect that the most uniquely you topics are going to exist nowhere else, right? You're going to have to invent them. And those are going to be the topics that most differentiate you from the competition. And so those are going to be partly most strategic. And you're going to look for also paradigm busting new directions, right? This will be important. You're not just looking to do something the way it's always been done or done elsewhere. You're going to be doing things that are new. And all this is going to lead to having to make tough decisions to create room for new content. Now, I've been alluding to this point, but I'm going to hammer it. There's no way around thinking about it uniquely for your own situation. You cannot copy others' homework. If we had a breakout session right now, you might talk to others about what's strategic for you. You might get inspired or get some new ideas about angles to pursue, but you can't copy somebody else's. It'll be unique. And so regarding the tough cuts here, let's lean into that a little bit. What should you cut from your legacy survey? Here's a quick a list of guidelines of the kinds of things that we initially look for. And so what puts an item at risk for being cut? First, scores that are 85% or higher. High scores are not the goal. A lot of people, you want to drive scores higher, you want to be high, you want to win, you want to beat benchmarks and so forth and so on. But high scores are not the goal. Improvement is, right? We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But you can also look for scores that are unchanged over maybe 5 years at the enterprise level, or a lot of times for sure you come from really large organizations and enterprise level change is really hard. It's like turning a battleship kind of a thing. But you can look at items unchanged in key business units or other places that don't have much variability. And all of this is hinting at a point, and this is about as statistical that I'm going to get for a second. Variance, standard deviation comes with low scores, and variance is synonymous to a statistician with information. The more variance, the more information. If everything is at 100% score, then there is zero new information that you're being told here. But you also want to look for items that have never really been part of the executive story, items that are not used in action plans. Depending on how you track action planning, you might have ways to kind of know what's happening here. That's kind of a different conversation, but do your best to figure out what is really being used, or in key indices. Maybe people are tracking certain things, whether turnover risk or merger and acquisition competency or union relationships or something like that. You might keep those or at least be mindful. You might have statistical evidence linking things to outcomes of interest, and those are items that you're more likely to want to keep. But if there's no statistical interest, then it's another point for potential deletion. Something that's statistically redundant. One of the things that we will be doing here when we add strategic content is we're often broadening what the survey will cover. So it's not just, red apples and green apples anymore, or even apples and oranges. You might be adding whole new food groups to your survey. And so statistically redundant, maybe you used to have some items that differentiated red from green apples, but now that's less important because it's still very apple-y and it's still very produce-y. And that when we want to add other kinds of things like soup to the mix, our strategic soup, we got to make room. And then also feels redundant to audiences. Now, these are not rigid rules. If the CEO likes to talk about an item, keep it, right? And one example might be pride or something like that, where a lot of times people just want to talk about how proud people are in the organization. If that's part of the important human story that you want to tell, keep it, right? Or if the CEO says, this item bugs me, I just want to hammer it and talk about it all the time. Leaning into that attention, if you can capture the CEO's mind share, that's worth it. Now, this is about cutting. There's another point we can make about refining legacy items. Maybe the topic is good, but traditional items might not be as useful as you'd hoped. And so, as you look at items, maybe they're scoring too high or something like that. You can move from weaker verbs like I'm encouraged or I understand or something like that to stronger, more behavioral verbs. And you can add specificity, like what does success really need in this topic? And you can consider maybe what promotes group level conversations. There are plenty of times where you want to keep questions about individuals, like a classic one is, I'm thinking about leaving the organization. That's an individual decision, right? And that's a great item that predicts turnover better than any other single item in the survey, generally. But most of what the survey is doing is trying to promote group level conversations, and particularly for organizations, which is most, I think, that give reports to managers and they're supposed to have conversations with their team. What they're trying to do is promote group level conversations. And if you can add a strategic edge or the vocabulary of executives to an item that you're changing, great. Okay, that sounds great, but what's an example? Well, I talked about innovation as an example. And so if we have an original item that's a fine item, I'm encouraged to come up with new and better ways of doing things. Many of you may have an item like this. It's been around, it's been popular for a really long time. And it's a classic and it's useful and it's something that's important, but scores are generally pretty darn high. So what is required for innovation? If we were to stop and think about this, it's not just like people are required for saying, oh yeah, here's a thought. That's the easy part of innovation. What's the hard part of innovation? Well, here's some improved examples that lean into some of these guidelines. How about this one? The best ideas get the notice and sponsorship needed to move them forward. All right, that's a tougher thing. It's also a group thing. It's also going to have a lower score. It's also one thing that's required for good ideas to even matter. Or how about this one? When we begin improvement efforts, we follow through to give them the best chance of success. If you think about when does innovation fail in organizations, it tends not to be coming up with ideas or sharing them or chatting. It's about focusing on the best ideas, making a real plan to have it happen, and then making sure that it sticks. And if these kinds of things are really echoing the CEO's frustrations, right, or how you talk about your product development roadmap, then way better than just I'm encouraged to come up with new and better ways of doing things. But this is just one example, right? It's a little bit like moving from an old school X-ray into an MRI. It's time to get a little bit more focused, a little bit more implication oriented, a little bit more strategically oriented. And so where does all this take you once you've figured out what you want to add, what you want to cut, and that sort of thing, maybe what you want to refine? You're going to find that if you succeed, you're going to have some lower scores on your next survey. That will take a little change management to convince people, but that is success. Lower scores is success. It is a couple of things. It is more of a burning platform to drive change. It has more variance and more information, especially to a statistician. You're going to have a little bit more sensitivity in your diagnosis. So I don't say you just want low scores. I want to say you want scores and items with more information in it, and those happen to be lower. So where do you go? What's a plausible design of what you want to tackle? Well, typically you want to target the same length as your current survey. I mean, you can edit that up or down as you want, but adding the strategic content is one thing, but you want to keep things like an engagement survey. You want to keep some key historical indicators, maybe engagement index or other key bundle of items like key drivers of engagement, something like that. You're probably going to have some topics that are streamlined or collapse with other topics as new topics emerge, right? So maybe a training and a recognition or a training and career might be collapsed into a development kind of a thing where then other topics will have space to become included. And you might find too that some key indices could be formalized. And when we talk index here, we talk about like a score or a group of items that cuts across topics that might not reflect a construct or the same exact issue, but cut across and are really tackling outcomes that you're addressing, like scalability issues might have a touch point in many different dimensions in a survey, but could become a key index. Or best predictors of quitting might touch upon a few different areas, and that kind of thing. So as I talk about this, you might be noticing that as you do your strategic work, it might suggest analyses, not just survey topics. As you go through this, analysis is a whole other topic maybe, but keep a list. You might find that it's not a full democratic process anymore, that some people's opinions might matter a little bit more than others in helping to diagnose strategic issues, right? Those people who have been acquired have something different to say than people who've been long tenured in the legacy organization. Those people who were part of co-creating new customer solutions will certainly have something different to say. And so segmentation work will be really important. So as we go through, certainly you can come up with all this stuff and you've got a great draft and you love it, but there's change to manage. And so, hey, can you simply change whatever you want in your survey? I guess that maybe one or two of you might be saying, sure, I've got that power, but most of you are going, oh, committees or something like that. And so there is socialization that needs to happen, and this is important. And just some quick kinds of points about this. It's hard, right? I don't want to diminish this by reducing it to just one slide, but some tips, focus change discussions on the conversations that surveys should drive, less on wording debates. So keep it focused on what is supposed to be happening, not just what you want to ask. And you want to emphasize connections to executive and strategic interests, and acknowledge that if cuts are not painful, then you're not cutting enough. This is a point that's kind of easy to say, and you all have lived it, I'm sure. But if you don't make a cut that makes you a little bit sad, then maybe you're not trying hard enough. And in a committee, at least one person is going to be sad about almost anything you do. And resist watering down items. There's a client that I dealt with where too many items got a caboose. And as I describe this, many of you are saying, ah, I'm familiar with the caboose. So there's an item like, recognized for delivering extraordinary customer service or extraordinary service, something like that. And the caboose is, with regard to the customer and our mission. So I'm recognized for providing service with regard to our customers and our mission. It's like, okay, I'm recognized for innovation, or I'm encouraged to innovate with regard to our customer and our mission, or whatever it happens to be. It's like adding those words does not help, right? You want to maintain that sort of edginess and not just water it down with a caboose. And you want to keep the discussions grounded in evidence. Have people be reminded and review potentially executive interview findings, or any historical behavior, or sometimes there was one organization, for example, where having an employee pretest, some people were convinced that a certain rhythm was going to be awesome and great, and we didn't think so, but we had a couple of sessions with employees where say, hey, pretend like you're really taking this survey, and people just stumbled, and it made the survey so much better, and some people got a little unstuck. And so just helping your committee members get unstuck is part of it. And of course, if you get into a taste great, less filling debate and there's no real clear resolution, you can always say, hey, let's keep a couple of items that might be a little redundant or a little similar, and we can use our data to trim it next round. That's fine. That's great. And so with all of this, hopefully you've been hearing about how to add strategic content to a survey, which is most of the time the most important element to help a survey move off into the future. Most surveys cover the ground of employee experience pretty well, but it's this other stuff and keeping the passions and attentions of executives that can be the tough part. And so I want to conclude with a message that leans into that, which is the precious commodity in today's workplace is not data. It's attention, not data. What does that mean? Well, many of you may remember a phrase, what gets measured gets done. That's out of date. We are in information saturated workplaces, and heck, the planet is saturated with information. There is more than we know what to do with, and we can always collect better data for sure. But really, the rare commodity is attention. And so what's the survey implication? That's kind of one of the big themes of this whole webinar here, is do not design for just pushing data or asking questions. Rather, design for capturing the attention, prompting constructive conversations, and nudging and compelling action. And that's a slightly different frame than maybe some of you all were taught in grad school, which is about validity and consistency and reliability and all those good things. And that's all important, but that's table stakes. You want to move to designing for capturing and attention and prompting some of this kind of action. So with that, I want to move to a little bit of Q&A. We've got about 15 minutes left for some of this kind of stuff. Certainly, if you have any questions or top takeaways, enter it through the Zoom chat boxes. And Jeff, let me ask: are there any questions coming in, or anything that we can prompt the next conversation about?
We've got a few that we can start with, and then as we go, if you have another question you'd like to ask, we're still monitoring the chat and the Q&A, so please ask your questions. But the first one I have here is, survey results are often presented by topics like communications or training or leadership, et cetera, et cetera. If you're doing a survey in a strategic fashion, would you organize the results in a different fashion than the historical content?
Quite possibly. And let me divide that up into separating out just like dimension structures or theme or category structures that a lot of us have with like a bunch of items that roll into one topic. I'm going to answer about that, but also answer about telling the story to executives, let's say, or to different audiences that might have different strategic interests. So, I mean, some of what you might do is collapse a couple of old dimensions together, and you might have a new dimension like, oh, scalability, or something like that, or compliance climate, or compliance orientation, whatever phrase you want to give it. So there might be some new full-on strategic dimensions that did not exist prior. But with something kind of like scalability, or there's one organization where the CEO had a particular label to his interest. And so we created an index that cherry picked the best items across dimensions that were part of that. And so what you might have an index that's like maybe something like a scalability index where it picks from manager items that support scalability and work process kinds of things that support scalability and stuff like that. And this index might get a little bit of a characterization, and it might be in all the reports. But certainly in the executive presentation, the table of contents in some way for a real strategic presentation is not, here's all the survey results topic by topic. The table of contents is best at, here's the strategic elements, the strategic emphases or pillars, whatever they are for you. Here's the strategic topics that the organization is facing over the next year and what the survey has been hitting. And here's what we can learn about each one of those. So you are spinning it, that kind of communication, more strategic topic by topic. It's like, look, we got a new sales strategy. We also are acquiring lots of organizations to support different types of innovation, and we're expanding our distribution channels. And so what can we say about each one of those? And some of those might have survey topics tied to them, and some of them might have segmentations, right, with more pivotal positions or informants from the employee survey. So yeah, things can change.
Yep.
And if they don't, maybe that's kind of a problem.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a survey just completed of a company that acquired another one, and one of their strategic questions was, how much turnover are we going to have with the people we're bringing in? And the survey was designed to answer that question for them. And then on the executive presentation, we broke out the heritage people who were from sort of the mothership and the heritage people who were from the new acquisitions to see, where do their opinions diverge and converge on that. Yeah. So it became very strategic for them in terms of how to integrate a new integration of a new acquisition. Here's another one. Is strategy always driven by overall corporate strategy, or are there times when strategy is dealing with broad environmental or economic issues that are rapidly changing? And the second part of that then is, do you handle that, or should you handle that through rapid, short pulsing surveys?
There's a lot wrapped up into that one.
Yeah, you can break it apart. Yeah.
Yeah, let me break it apart. And let me also say, well, first, is it driven by corporate? Yeah. I mean, it's a company strategy. If you're a retailer, you might have the same overarching, macroeconomic or planetary pressures that your competitors do. And so those pressures aren't unique for you. What is unique for you is how your organization is planning on dealing with that, right? So here's sort of maybe an extreme example that COVID hit and the entire planet, had to change. How some organizations coped with that and their approach to how they managed COVID, and working from home and shutting down operations or not, et cetera, et cetera. That became sort of the differentiator between you and your competition. And so that's the kind of thing that is a little bit more important maybe to focus on from a strategic angle. Dealing with COVID and remote work, I mean, that's hugely important, and everybody had to do stuff. And there's a lot that we can learn from what other organizations do. But the strategic magic dust is how you do things differently. And so that's, you're talking about pressures from outside. Yeah, I mean, any organization's strategy should be influenced by external dynamics, right? But it's you want to speak the language of your own organization and how the organization is dealing with it. Yeah, another part of that you were talking about, is it at the level of the organization or above? You can also say, is it below? There's some business unit strategies, depending on the appetite for your organization and how customized you might get business unit by business unit. A lot of business units have different kind of approaches. If you've got, production forces versus engineering forces, those might have different angles on why that function exists and what they're supposed to do, like just make stuff or invent stuff. And those are two different different pulls, right? And different kinds of talent pools and different kinds of HR strategies behind dealing with all those things. So it's a delicate line to draw. Like, when do you lean into business unit by business unit kind of differences versus not?
And I
think you
suppose
had
that could
another.
be, well, I suppose that could be done through supplements, but the second part of this was, would you ever deal with sort of a rapidly changing strategic environment through the use of short pulse surveys?
Sure. Yeah, why not? But rather than say, should we pulse and then figure out the topics, it's like work backwards. It's like, what are the information, what do we need to know? And how fast is all that changing? And how fast can we respond to those changes, right? So just because information changes on a daily basis doesn't mean you should survey on a daily basis, right? Just because information changes on a quarterly basis doesn't mean an annual is not fine, right? So you want to balance your follow through and what the survey assignment is, right? Because if we're trying to change, like, what helps you make change? But start and work backwards. Don't just say, you know what, our customer surveys are, every day and ongoing, so let's have our employee survey. It's like that's talking about mechanics first and meaning second, or an action maybe not at all. You want to start the other direction.
Here's a sort of a slightly different question, which is, if the CEO or HR person, CHRO, reads something in, as you said, Harvard Business Review, and they want to do something because of that, but it's not really aligned with the strategy of the company. It's not strategic. How do you, in your experience, how do you communicate to them that it's not a good idea? What would your approach be?
Well, let me, in that question, let me say, if it's not strategic, doesn't mean it's not a good idea. Let me just make that. It can be important, right? And so let me first say, it's like, hey, that's a great idea. But like, there's a couple of different versions of reading stuff and going crazy. Like, Great Resignation was overstated, right? And so if people read stuff about the Great Resignation, it's like, hey, we need something. It's like, well, chances are you probably already had it. It was just called engagement or turnover risk or something already. But lean into the energy that this person is bringing, because capturing attention, like I've said, is gold, and you want to maintain that. But is it organizational strategy? Maybe not, and that can be fine, and it can still be important. You need to evaluate that. But we don't want to be faddish. Is it HR strategy. Now, an HR strategy versus corporate strategy, we didn't really get into that mix here. There's some nuances there, but an HR strategy includes championing the people and the interests and values of sort of being employee centric and some other things. And some of that might be okay if you're reading the right stuff, but I think you talk about like how to manage this person that comes like in a CHR that comes at you with this. Like if you can have a conversation about not just the topic, but what they're trying to accomplish with the topic, or what's the underlying concern. And you could ask questions like, how does that relate to our organization strategy of
Yeah.
dramatic growth or whatever it happens to be.
A couple of quick ones then. You talked about variance, where, or you talked about making the questions tougher, right? And the scores are likely to go down. Have you ever seen scores go down due to other things like higher standards on the part of the employees? And
Oh,
would
for
you
sure.
consider that a strategic success?
Yes. I mean, I think this is a great question. And for those of you who can remember back to any statistical classes in grad school with alpha, beta, and gamma change, right? It's like, rather than dwelling on vocabulary, like if you think about something like DEI, DEIB, what does it mean to be inclusive? The meaning has changed and the bar has changed. And we've done some mapping, and one of our consultants, Victoria Hendrickson, has a great chart that sort of shows some of this, where from 2000 until now, there's been a lot of things out in the world like Me Too and George Floyd and other kinds of things, particularly in the United States, on racial tensions and what does it mean to be inclusive and so forth and so on. And definitions are changing and standards are changing. And I think on a topic like that, if things get a little lower, that doesn't mean it's not real. It means that this is the reflection of today. And so there's been other organizations where one leader said, you know what, people are feeling a little too cocky about our customer orientation, and I want to give them data to show them that to help calibrate their opinions. And so the scores went down. And so that was great, right? That's a sign of success. But it's again echoing that it ain't about the score itself. It's about the meaning that you derive from it and the action and the conversations that you prompt from it.
I think we can squeeze in one final one, but we only have just a minute left, but quickly, can non-content processes, would you change them? Things like training and action planning, etc. Would you change them to make them more strategic?
I think so, and there's a lot that can be said about this, but maybe just a quick thing is, if you're an organization where, and let me pick on an old example here, that the Department of Labor is coming up with new regulations and you got to be compliant with it. But mandating that everybody works on compliance culture or compliance orientation, that's great, right? I mean, that is extending the leadership power down through the fingertips of the organization, by mandating that everybody has a conversation about compliance and maybe service and the balance of the two. And it's a conversation dictated by the organizational strategy and informed by the survey data. Yeah, you can't get any better than that. And that's a change, right? Or an adaptation of maybe what an organization was used to, but just driving it with a different point of view.
Okay. We are out of time. Scott, any final wrap-up words you'd like to give?
I think that final, example, I think probably did it for me, but, work towards conversations and capturing attention, and particularly energy at the top, and hope that your scores are lower and manage around the change that requires. So Thanks, everybody. It's been fun.
Thanks for your time.
Good luck with your survey. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.